night, and Daniela and I are very happy to be here with Avery Gordon, who has been sponsored by COES, by the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies, and it's been a very full 3 days, I think, for Avery. She is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is also a professor at the Law School of Birkbeck, University of London, and these are her formal titles. And we want to thank you very much for your incredible talk Monday night at the Museum of Memory and Human Rights. The title of that was Pensar desde los márgenes utópicos, and it was a full crowd, and that was very exciting to hear both your lecture and the kinds of questions that came from that. And then yesterday, the doctoral seminar at the School of Architecture and Urban Studies at the Catholic University, where again, we had a full crowd of doctoral students and a few postdoctoral students that were very excited to have you. So, welcome to Santiago and to COES, Avery.
Thank you, Katie and Daniela. I really very much appreciate the invitation, the work that both of you have done to plan such a gracious and hospitable visit that I've had, as well as, of course, all the institutional co-sponsors that Katie just mentioned. It's been wonderful to meet people and to see things. And this is my first time to Chile, so everything is new and everything is interesting, so it's very nice to be here.
I hope it's the first of many future visits.
I very much would love to return, definitely.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. Avery, we wanted to start this conversation asking you about what kind of context, in what kind of context, what kind of academic, political, and cultural context does your work intervenes? How do you see it in terms of who are you talking with and in what moment?
Well, let's just start with who rather than the moment per se. But I am very much working, I would say, in 3 different kinds of contexts. So one is the academic context, both in terms of being a full-time professor. That's my job, and I do that, and I teach lots of students. Sociology, or some version of sociology, I teach them. And then there is the context of working with artists and also as a kind of itinerant intellectual or an itinerant scholar in that world, which is an interesting one because there's almost a kind of para-academic world, you could say, that's very active and vibrant in a segment of the contemporary art world that's not so commercially driven, but is very active in creative forms of exhibition and creative forms of conceptual thinking, and with whom I have, with a segment of it, very much shared intellectual and political affiliations. So that's one place I've been working now pretty steadily, primarily in Europe, since now the early 2000s, really. But the third context is really the media, because I have now since 1997 had a weekly radio program with Elizabeth Robinson called No Alibis. And that is sort of a very quiet, steady part of my life, of doing the news and public affairs radio program every week. So that I see as a place where my work, but it's very different. It's not academic at all, but it's also not artistic in that sense either. It's a grassroots radio station, and we do news and do interviews with people, most of whom don't have access to the public media, and their voices are not heard in that kind of way, covering social and economic and political issues, mostly contemporary. Every once in a while there's something historical that becomes a contemporary issue of one sort or another. So those are 3 places where I'm working, the academic and the artist is a little bit more integrated, you could say. I also have my work that I do as a active citizen, or an activist citizen, particularly around the question of imprisonment. So I've been working on that for a long time. And so those are the main sort of sites in which the work is done. And I would say in all of them, what prompts the work more than anything else is some kind of observation or feeling or reaction to what is happening in the present, what's happening out there in the world that needs some kind of address, I feel. So it's less that the academic work is, I always sort of say I'm not a regular scholar, because even though I am trained as a scholar and I spend time in the library and I have a certain carefulness that my artist colleagues of course don't have, and so that you really see the clash of that. I am not driven by intellectual or academic questions in that sense. So whatever sociology is and isn't thinking is not usually what is prompting the work. The prompt of the work comes from somewhere else, comes from sort of urgent questions that I see in the world. So that's sort of how the prompts work, and those are the domains, the terrains.
Yeah.
That
Well,
answers
let's
your
talk
questions.
about that.
Okay.
And you feel in your new, very significant and multimedia, quite imaginative, not surprisingly, your new book, Letters from the Hawthorne Archive, Letters from the Utopian Margins, the Hawthorne Archive. You talk, I think, in the beginning, and it seems to carry forward also from Ghostly Matters, your first really also very important work, that you're pushing us to be inspired to open up to the idea of living otherwise. And or you put it as, quote, living within and against, unquote, dominant systems of oppression. So that you're also doing this, as you said, very much in conversation, literally, in the book, with artists and art theorists. And I wondered if you could talk about that. So.
Sure. So there are two ways to answer that. One is historically, in the sense of when I had been working with artists in a much more just ad hoc way for quite some time now, actually. Early work I did with the American artist Leon Golub or the American artist Gary Simmons, and there had been these projects of working with artists. In Ghostly Matters itself, the question of the image is the photograph, but also the image in general is quite central to that book. But I began to get involved with European artists and curators in really the early 2000s. And for me, that particular moment was important because I was coming out of a period of being really administratively overworked in my job at the University of California and feeling like I really needed intellectual rejuvenation to kind of get back into a spirit of learning and study and engagement and so on, as opposed to writing memos and things like that. Katie's nodding, she knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And that context was so enormously generative for me. Just at the time, I encountered a set of people who had they were dealing with very similar kinds of questions. They were taking up, they had political affiliations and standpoints that were I was in solidarity with and that were familiar and comfortable, but there was like the windows were open. They weren't bound by academic protocols, they weren't bound by the competitions in the academic environment, and they weren't also, of course, bound by those disciplinary norms, even rubbing against them. They were really operating in a different world. That own world has its own issues and its own problems and its own requirements and tensions and so on. It's not to say to be naive about that, but there was especially then a real effervescence and energy in that world for taking up these questions. So one of the first projects I did with artists in this phase was invited by the German curator Anselm Franke, who was mounting a show around the question of haunting with 3 amazing artists, Judith Hoff, Ines Chabert, and Natasha Sador-Hagigian. And it was with Ines Chabert that I did a major project for Documenta about haunting and imprisonment, and Natasha and I have stayed the closest over time, and we have done a series of projects together subsequently. And so here I was encountering people who were completely thinking about these same issues, but in a different medium and in a different context, but with a kind of intellectual engagement that was frankly more interesting and sharper in a way than what I had been experiencing in the academy. So historically, that's kind of how it started. Conceptually, there are other ways to think about that, and I mean, the two in particular, specifically with respect to the Hawthorne Archive project, was I began to work under the rubric of the Hawthorne Archive. So for many years, the Hawthorne Archive has been the primary work identity that I have used in that context, as the keeper of that archive. And so it, in and of itself, is a project that I'm reluctant to call it an artist project, because I don't think I'm an artist. I know enough artists to know I'm not an artist. But there are ways in which it does partake in what looks like an artistic project, as opposed to a more academic one. And because of the need around this particular question of the utopian margins to traffic in the factual and the fictional, if you like, or to traffic in fabulation in a way, it almost, it was inevitable that it was going to become something that looked either like a novel. I mean, so one option would be one writes a novel, one writes a science fiction novel, so to speak, or some kind of futuristic novel, or maybe not, or one thinks about it writing something completely fictional, which I did not want to do for reasons having to do with what the book is about, which was specifically contesting the idea that the utopian is merely a futuristic, no-place, phantasmatic space. So once you're already working between the factual and the fabulational, you're already in the zone of what artistic research is.
Yes.
So you're kind of already there. So it's not just working with artists, it's working also in that sense with, you could say, an artistic mindset or an artistic approach.
That's opening up a language for you too, that you're, I think about your Anselm Frank, the both animism and then how you upend how you think about what's civilization, what's barbarism, kinds of very old debates, and you mobilize imagery to that, and you mobilize events.
Yeah, so given that I was working under this rubric of the Hawthorne Archive, then you have something like an archive. Well, then what is an appropriate, if you like, mode of knowledge production for an archive? Well, you can't just write about the archive in outside of its own language, then you must create and work with that. And so in that sense, the book is a quite, it is like a material assembly of letters and documents and images and file notes, and in that sense it is very, very constructed. And that, for me, a little bit was deliberate, because I really wanted to never lose sight of the significance of the mode of production, whether that's the broader modes of production in which we live in a capitalist society, or the mode of production of our own work. And so it's not as elegant as it would be if it narrativized or fictionalized the stories in it in a different kind of way. That might produce a very beautiful but different book than this one. Does that sort of answer the...
And then maybe we...
Yeah. Do you see a relationship between the materiality of the book and the archive, Hawthorne archives, and the idea of utopia that you are framing there?
Yes.
Can you explain?
Yeah. So this project is very much, in every way, trying to, how shall we say, provide an alternative way of thinking about what the utopian could mean. And I put it that way because I'm less interested in going in great detail into, in the book, what it has meant. I mean, this is almost taken for granted in the book. There's little bits here and there, but it's almost taken for granted. The book, in some way, starts after that point, after the point in which one has already identified what's missing in the historiography, in the theoretical discourse, etc., of this term. And what was missing for me was the vast array of social struggles, of forms of alternative thought and living that were, in effect, challenging the sort of modern capitalist world, and specifically challenging it with an understanding that that modern capitalist world was always a modern racial capitalist world. And so what did it mean for a historiography or a notion of utopian to not include anywhere all the vast experiences and experiences of slaves running away, and the experiences of their creating maroon settlements, their own societies. And that seemed to me, now there's a model for the utopian, about how you create the world you need in the here and now. And so the book is very much about that, but again, you have to enter into a somewhat fictional universe in which you are in, if you like, a sort of future conditional tense, in which there is the timeline, if you like, of at least the Euro-American historiography of the world. So this is definitely not true for Asia in many ways. It's just, it's limited in that way. But we have a modernist timeline, and it's there, it's operative, but somehow the Hawthorne archive collects not just documents, but people, and has its own history that's running in the margins of that mainstream timeline. And this was part of the reason for reading some of that alternative timeline at the lecture on Monday night, to say, in 1230, a nun is running away. Now what if we think about history in that way, running away from a convent? And so it's, in that sense, the project is partially about just providing a vocabulary for being more comfortable with the utopic, if you could say, and getting it out of the realm of being almost a insult that you throw at a comrade. That's utopian, that's unrealistic. I mean, it's almost traditionally used in the left circles that I came up with as an epithet.
Yes.
It's like an insult.
Living within the possible.
Yeah.
In Chile.
And so it's trying to just pry that open without getting obsessed with the term utopian. So there's, hopefully people will read that there's some humor in this book, because there's a kind of running commentary about all kinds of things, including the disorganization of the keeper so that the records are very incomplete, the discussions that are had but never get anywhere, I mean, it sort of tries to provide some little, I don't know, almost like just a trace of a culture that's there.
Maybe you could share, in fact, about this question of what constitutes utopian, these spaces of struggle, or what many conventionally would not read as utopian. So this passage about non-participation, if we can find it, because that also plays on, both waking people up to think in ways we don't about non-participation, or what we label as non-participation, but it's also fun. It's got humor.
It does have humor. Okay. I mean, one thing I will say is that a lot of people have been both thinking and also in terms of political struggles on the ground experimenting with forms of political and social struggle in a post-revolutionary era, in which our old notions of national liberation struggles, I mean, this is a big issue for Chile, of course, because you had bordering on a successful one. But I mean, we are post this moment in so many ways. And yet we are not anywhere outside of the world that needed those movements. And so people are grappling in many ways with, well, what are the alternative forms? And there are, we have become very accustomed to a model of social mobilization and what sociologists call social movements that have, recognized repertoires now that have been developed in the post-war period that involve mass mobilization for peaceful protest and various ways to mobilize one's interest, to gather the attention of democratic representatives, the state, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, there have always been more radical struggles, more anti-state, more anarchistic, and then increasingly since the mid-90s, really movements connected more globally in this way, more horizontalist movements, whether we think about it in terms of all the movements that really started in Latin America and Asia against the World Trade Organization and globalization in the mid-90s that for Americans at least culminate 1999 in Seattle, and et cetera, onto the Ocupalos and so on. And so these are all, you can see people grappling for new forms of social struggle. And these new forms use a different language, and they are much more willing to speak about refusal, of non-participation, of occupation, of fugitivity now, especially in the US, in terms of black struggles has re-emerged in a way that it wasn't present since the pre-Civil War period in the United States. So that language has resurrected for interesting reasons. And so the question of what various forms of non-participation are taken up in this book in various ways, and so one of the files in this book is a memo that is written to the Potential Classification Project. Okay, and I'll just read a little bit from it. Is that okay?
Yeah,
okay. It says, "Hello to everyone on the Potential Classification Project. Here are my thoughts after the first preliminary meeting, bringing newcomers up to speed and reporting back on the assignment I was given. We can discuss at the next meeting along with any other reports circulated, and will the permanent war deserters send a word on their recent successful deployments to the First Nations?" So it describes a request that I'm going to read and not read of it. So it describes a request that the Hawthorne Archive received from the Museum of Non-Participation, which I had already dealt with by the time this memo was written. And it says, the request raised again the question of what non-participation is, what we mean by it, what is its relationship to other adjacent or even allied concepts such as escape, running away, marronage, fugitivity, and abolition, and whether in fact we do have a considerable collection on it, which I had said we did. And the question is whether we should or shouldn't attempt to prepare a clear definition. So this is the question. Once again, the suggestion was made that there might be some utility in trying to prepare a clear definition that could then be used to classify existing activities and materials more carefully and to encourage further collaborations, deposits, projects, and so on. The understanding is that we didn't want or need a clear definition, that wasn't our job to prepare one for others, and that we had other ways of reaching out to friends, comrades, and possible collaborators, but the matter wasn't settled. And then I was given this memo is actually from me. Not all the memos are from me, but this one was actually from me. The matter wasn't settled, and few people were asked to delve into specific questions, and mine was to distinguish between types of non-participation that embody a logic of protest and those that don't, reflecting the recent upsurge in arrivals to the archive. So here's what it says. Unfortunately, as soon as you start to try to hold this distinction steady to explain it, it begins to fall apart. At first, it seems clear that forms of non-participation that embody a logic of protest are actions, almost always used in combination with other activities, whose purpose is to force a governing corporate, judicial, or patriarchal authority to do something it has thus far refused to do. Stop waging war, pay higher wages, hire better people, convict a criminal, release a criminal, control the police, build houses, restrain greedy landlords, permit a contact visit, stop building prisons, change, modify, eliminate a law, share power, stop deporting people without visas, govern responsibly, end an occupation, provide free health care, redistribute money, tell the truth, be fair, be inclusive of difference and dissent, fix the train tracks, regulate the banks, open free schools, pay respects, etc. Okay, the archive has a lot of lists because it is very much about roll calls in accounting. So there's a lot of lists. Okay, it says, then it becomes necessary to admit as protest actions those that don't want to make clear demands to the authorities that nonetheless take form or shape as collective visible mobilization in public places, such as the various Occupy encampments, public actions with unusual forms, such as the 1969 hex thrown on the stock market by a fraction of the women's liberation movement, various collective witnessings, such as Witness Against Torture, and on and on and on, into the mess of generalizations, qualifications, exclusions, insults, and errors. Okay, I won't keep reading, but it continues to go on. It's types of non-participation that aren't protest, harder to describe, but they are there. Many of them, one of the examples I give actually is the example of Graciela Carnaval, who people might know of here because she was part of an avant-garde group that was very active in Argentina in the mid-1960s. And that group had organized several very politicized audience interactive events, including in 1968 in this famous exhibit called Tucumán Arde, Tucumán is burning, until 1969 when to protest state censorship and repression, they basically went silent and they abandoned art. And then she really didn't return herself, Carnaval, to work until the mid-1990s. So she was for really a long time essentially in a state of refusing to work over the repression in Argentina. But she, over this time, maintained the archive, so that the archive maintained, it's still living and you can access it. So there are things like that are clearly a form of non-participation, of refusal, but how do you describe a form of refusal is no longer a protest when it becomes a way of living. you start to do it for 20, 30 years, it's not a protest in that sense anymore. And the place where this piece goes, which for me is important, is then to try to talk about some of these forms of non-participation that don't embody a logic of protest at all, but might in the future, but that are very much bound up with what the sociologist Asaf Bayat calls quiet encroachment, which for me has been a very important idea. And I very much like his work called Life as Politics. He's an Iranian sociologist, and this idea of quiet encroachment describes the way in which essentially poor people in the world's great metropolises, in this case he's talking about places like Cairo and so on, but it's applicable, Mexico City, it's applicable in many other places, where poor people who have essentially been abandoned by the state must create their own forms of life. They must, basically they build illegal housing, they, develop illegal transportation systems, they do all these things, and it doesn't appear as political mobilization, although it takes a huge amount of political knowledge to make it work, and it does work quite well. But then at any moment it can shift. And so it is at the same time a kind of what I would call, this isn't so much Asaf's language, but a kind of preparation for some other kind of collective mobilization at some point. And in fact, in Bayat's case, he published that book maybe 2 months before the occupation of Tahrir Square. And I'll never forget watching him on the news, or in a radio program perhaps, and people were saying, how could this have happened? And he said, I'll tell you exactly how it could have happened. Because it was already in effect, in play, in place, happening. And it needed only a provocation, you could say, to make something that had been completely invisible before an operative, political, social, collective mass mobilization. And so that's part of what I mean by non-participation being sort of a complex, it's a complex way of thinking about a continuum of ways of relating to the world as it is, and how the world as it is relates to you. So non-participating is very different if you are a very poor person with few means. Non-participation isn't much of a choice. It's very different for me to decide, well, I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to participate in voting for Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That I consider that an insult to the notion of democracy. It's a very different choice. Whether it's a right choice or a wrong choice, it's a very different kind of choice to make. So that's part of what was happening with the idea of non-participation, also connected to this idea of preparation and preparing for living the life that you would rather have by living it as much as you can within the terms available to you, and thinking consistently about how that is going to be scaled up when it's time.
Preparation. Yeah. I was thinking you talked to her about her four days here in Santiago. And again, this question of now having spent a little bit of time here, but not expecting you to have to speak authoritatively about Chile. But you felt it in some of the questions that have been posed to you, and in terms of how you're thinking about the utopian margins relates to issues that are often called euphemistically coming to terms with the past, and here in Chile, our very recent past that's a blatant, oppressive, violent past that envelops a society that produced fear or self-censorship, silence, and the resonances you feel that of that, you recognize that here, that it's still very felt. So how might you think about your theorization in relation to what Chile's been going through, or what you have sensed about questions of struggle, participation, refusal?
Yeah, because just to give a little bit of context, in the seminar yesterday, you observed that the understanding of justice was very tied to the idea of institutional justice, and you were asking what is missing there, what other notions of justice we can see, or how can we think of this relationship with the past beyond the limits of law and beyond criminalization. And I found that that discussion is key for thinking human rights movements in Chile now and how they project into the future.
Okay, I'll try to answer. I feel also reluctant I have read a little bit, but I'm only here such a short period of time, so I'm very mindful of what I don't know as opposed to what I do know. But when you asked me, Katie, to begin with about coming to terms, and this morning you said to me, kind of like reckoning, that's the word you used for it, and so part of how I have thought about that, certainly in terms of haunting, has been that the reckoning sort of emerges with the haunting. In other words, that the haunting is a sign that the social violence has been unresolved, that what had been repressed, or even a whole system of repression, is returning or emerging or is making trouble present for people in some way. And so the reckoning, the coming to terms with it, is coming to terms with what? And so in the case of Chile, I think there are, if you like, I don't even want to say there are two levels, because I don't want to say that they're that separate, but they do, practically speaking, we operate them at two different levels. And the one level is literally the level of caring for the individuals most impacted by the dictatorship, the families of the survivors themselves, the people who were at the sharpest edge of its weapons, you could say. So the whole society was, of course, affected dramatically. I mean, this is what your work is about, Daniela, the generational passing on of the violence. But there, you are closer or further away. So there is, on the one hand, literally the caring for people. And that is absolutely crucial. And I mean, that was so beautifully evident at the tour that I was giving yesterday at the stadium, which was very moving in that way. I mean, the really just beautiful care for the place and for the people. And that, to me, is absolutely, you cannot do the second element without the first. Okay, if you do the second element is, of course, then dealing with the deeper social, political, economic conditions that produced the dictatorship in the first place. And those are old, and they predate 1970. So then you have a longer history. You're back in that modernist timeline. And we're going back to conquest and colonization. And then we have a different set of conditions who are sedimented and change and develop, but who linger too. And often these two get split, right? We're dealing with the social struggles, the political issues, and then the people are ignored. Or they're both the social psychological element of it, but also just the personal need to care for individuals who were harmed as individuals. So that, to me, is very important. And that, what I saw yesterday, and that was just very beautiful. for that. There's a real feeling for it. Just seemed very, very moving.
At the National Stadium, yeah.
Well, yeah, because we had this tour
Yeah.
with the people who are very committed to standing there every day and doing that. And so that's one element of it. But what I heard very much, both at the stadium and also in all the papers that I read, was everybody saying, we have this process of institutional justice, legal justice, but somehow we haven't achieved it yet. So everyone was expressing a concern while justice had not been achieved yet. And also that even when the dictatorship ended, that elements of people had different languages for this, but that elements of the dictatorship somehow were passed along, not somehow, everybody knows how, legally and in other ways. And so I was in some ways also responding to that. So in order to get people, I mean, this was also in a pedagogical environment, right? So in order to ask people to think about what has lingered, what is there, what is the blockage to justice? Is it merely that we need 10 more court cases and we haven't had them yet? Is it merely that, well, if we replace that judge with this judge, our problems would be solved? Is it that we need 3 more laws, but if we had them, everything would be good? And I think the answer to that was no, by everyone there. I mean, one of the papers we talked about was, about the inability to bury the dead president. 4 times brought back from the dead because something is still not right about that. We are not convinced that it's over. So that's where I was pushing. What is the it? How do you grasp that? And to me, that is what the reckoning is about at a social, political level, and that requires a language. Okay, so we are accustomed to use the word justice. Social justice often gets put in front of it to mean something broader than merely legal justice or a juridical form of justice. That social justice has also become somewhat euphemistic, a way of not saying, well, we're going to need a non-capitalist economy, and how are we going to affect that? Or social justice means we are going to need non-patriarchal societies. How are they going to be made? So it can become euphemistic. A young Indigenous scholar named Eve Tuck, she has written a little book called The Glossary of Haunting. And there is a point in which she is quite critical, and of me, of using the term social justice. And she says, that word gives me a very bad feeling. And it's partially from an experience as an Indigenous person, and a sense of the long durée of forms of oppression and exploitation and exclusion and human genocide, cultural genocide, and so on. And you have to start to poke into those places to get at those deeper structures. But the question is, what is being built that would be less likely rather than more likely to create that opportunity?
Mm-hmm.
We have to talk about militarism and militaries. This is mostly how authoritarian governments maintain power. They have control of armies and police. So that's, my reaction is that, but there's nothing, just to say this, that there's nothing special, or I don't mean that, I just mean nothing wrong. This is a problem that everyone is dealing with all over the place, how to grapple with this. And maybe people here will be more able to do so because of the strong histories of social struggle. Because when you excavate the memory, And the history of the popular unity government, that is a memory of a history of an alternative way of life, really. And one whose basic values, that is what the high school students are fighting for in Chile, that is what all the movements today, that's they're fighting for the same values, the same principles. Maybe the exact form of the society will look a little different. But the basic principles, they are already there. We already know what they are. So you could retrieve that. You know, one of my favorite haunting lines is actually by Herbert Marcuse, not Derrida. And one of the things that Marcuse said is he said the historical alternatives haunt a given society. And that's what I heard. I heard people feeling that and looking for a language for it and trying to express it. And all I did was just say, maybe you're trying to say that.
It's a very nice way.
Yeah, and makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. So,
I think we have to close now.
Okay.
We are on time.
yes,
Unfortunately.
that was
Good for us to be on
that
time.
was a perfect end.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Avery.
Thank you both.
There is
Yeah,
thank
thank you for the
a
good
lot to
questions.
think after this insightful reading of what is going on after your visit to the stadium. Today we're going to the Museum of Memory, so
I will learn more.
More
and
later.
it'll be good. And then the next time I come back, I
Yeah.
will know more and be more able to speak intelligently about the
so
Chilean
helpful.
situation.